talking to Congresswoman Karen Bass and William Barr's Senate confirmation hearings for Attorney General. Your opinion on that? Where have you weighed in?
Oh, well, I certainly would not support his confirmation. Wish I was over in the Senate and I could cast the vote. But two things with him. One, it's extremely hard to believe him considering he was auditioning for the job months ago, wrote memos talking about a president really shouldn't be investigated in the manner in which President Trump is being investigated. But also, he has called historically for more incarceration. And that is going the exact opposite direction of people who have recognized that the United States has more people in prison than any nation on the planet, and we need to reform our system. He feels the opposite way.
As far as an investigation goes, though, he has said that he would not stop it. He might not release all the information.
But it's just hard to believe because of what he has written in the past. So I certainly hope he's had a change of heart. He's also not said he would recuse himself either.
Let's move on to another question, the citizenship question on the 2020 census. Right now it's been held off.
Well, and I'm so glad that the court stopped it. Frankly, that would be devastating to California because you would have people who would not cooperate with the census, which would mean our count would be low, which could have devastating impact in terms of resources and our representation. So I am hoping that there will not be a citizenship question on the census.
Let me ask this question, though, because most people will say, well, if you're not a citizen, why should you count?
Well, because you're here, and when it comes to federal resources, when it comes to representation in Congress, you know, you still have to provide. So if a person is here, they still need to be counted. Let me mention another census issue, though, is the way we count people who are incarcerated. You know that we count them where they are incarcerated as opposed to where they're coming home to. And so what that does is that shortchanges a lot of communities. Communities in Los Angeles, like South Central LA, East LA, for example, prisoners would be counted in rural California where the minute they get out, they're certainly coming back home. So it shortchanges us in terms of resources.
How much of that could be corrected at this time, though?
Well, I actually think that it can be, and given that we have such great leadership on a state level, I am hoping that we'll be able to correct it. I do worry about the rest of the country, but I think our state legislatures will move to correct that.
Let's talk about something that the new Congress is trying to correct, H.R. 1, voting rights, voter registration.
Yes.
How does this change things?
Well, so a couple of things. One, we need to have the Voting Rights Act voted on and signed by the president again. What H.R. 1 is calling for right now is an expansion of voting. So in our country, we need to be doing everything we can to encourage people to vote. Instead, we actually do the opposite. Again, not California, but the rest of the country. And so H.R. 1 will expand access to voting.
Now, H.R. 1 will do some of the things that California does do, which, as you know, we've just heard that the motor voters, there was some difficulty here in California on registration because that particular system had some glitches in it. And I think the president has seized on some of California's voting patterns as saying that there's a great deal of fraud happening, that undocumented immigrants are the ones who are casting so many ballots.
What they're worried about with California is that too many people vote here. If you remember, he lost the popular vote by about 3 million votes, and a lot of those votes came out of California. The only voter fraud that was found in the last election was on behalf of Republicans. For example, in the state of Georgia, I'm absolutely convinced that Stacey Abrams is the one that should be the governor. The voter suppression that happened, you had the Secretary of State who was running against her, who was in charge of the process. If that had been the opposite with Democrats, that would have never happened. So only voting fraud, the voting fraud in North Carolina, that election still hasn't been determined because of the fraud, but it was on behalf of Republicans.
Talk about voter suppression and what that means. It almost seems institutional in some places.
Well, I think it absolutely is institutional in some places. And so you might recall a busload of voters in Georgia who were going to the polls, and they wouldn't let them vote. You have situations in the South where they will close the voting place, they will move the voting place, they will make it so difficult to register. So back in the day, when they used to have the poll tax, or they used to, as John Lewis say, you would have to count the number of jelly beans in a jar. They've just come up with they've just come up with a 21st century way of blocking people from vote, and I think that's rampant in the South. Again, I know there's some parts of California where we might have problems, but we really do live in a little bubble here in California. What happens here does not happen in the rest of the country.
About 2 minutes left, Congresswoman. I want to talk a little bit about the Affordable Care Act, health care, and whether some of the things that have been taken away from it, such as the mandatory part of it, has had any impact, and what do you see for it going forward?
Well, it has had impact, but the good news is that people are continuing to sign up. So the Republicans could not repeal the Affordable Care Act, even though they tried several times. But what the Trump administration has been doing is attempting to kill it with 1,000 cuts. And so one of the things that we have to do now that Democrats are in control is to repair some of the damage of the Trump administration. One of the first things we're going to do is look at the price of prescription drugs.
That's something that pretty much everybody agrees on, though, correct? I mean,
it is something everybody agrees on, but you would think the richest country in the history of the world, the only industrialized nation on the planet that can't figure out how to provide health care for its population, and we took a major step forward with the Affordable Care Act, and that people are actually trying to prevent people from having health care. That's shameful.
They're telling us to wrap up, Congresswoman Karen Bass. Thank you very much. Hope that shutdown ends next week.
I do, too.
Come back and see us.
Thank you very much.
All right.